He and his girlfriend were not the most romantic of couples. In fact, their idea of spicing up their relationship was making out in the dark. He came over to her house late one night when her parents were out of town, and they lay down on her bed together. He turned off the bedside lamp, grabbed her hands in his, and began kissing her gently. The thing about darkness is it heightens your other senses. The sound of her gentle breathing beginning to quicken, the sweet smell of perfume at the base of her neck, the taste of her lips, the feel of her nails beginning to dig into his shoulders. Despite the darkness, his eyes snapped open as he realized that both of her hands were still clasped firmly in his own. My grandmother grew up in the slums of Prohibition-era Chicago. Her family lived in a small house near the harbor, and one of her earliest memories was of a particularly hot summer when, seeking respite from the heat, her and her sister discovered a seldom-used section of boardwalk near an abandoned warehouse. Every night for several weeks, the two girls would make their way down to the docks and sit together on the edge of the pier as the sun went down. My grandmother vividly, and for a time fondly, recalled the feel of the seaweed between her toes as her and her sister dangled their feet into the murky water. It wasn't until years later that she returned to the pier and found that the warehouse had been demolished. Curious, she made an inquiry with the Department of Planning and Development. Apparently, the warehouse had been owned for a time by the mob, who was using it as a base of operations for a local prostitution racket. It had only been uncovered when an associate began disposing of rival hookers by fitting them with concrete shoes and dumping them into the harbor. Investigating officers had recovered nearly 24 bodies from the waters of the secluded pier. How had the bodies been discovered? A passing fisherman spotted some of the victims' hair floating near the surface of the water, like seaweed. Marie Thibodeau, 1801 to 1881, was a remarkable woman. She was kind, intelligent, headstrong, and never once told a lie. She was also a voodoo high priestess. She lived her entire life in New Orleans, establishing a reputation from an early age as a potent healer and clairvoyant. People traveled for miles simply to visit her apothecary, although many more sampled her legendary concoctions. By the 1870s, she had simultaneously become one of the most feared and revered figures in Louisiana. In 1881, a landowner named Jacob Parrish traveled to New Orleans from Baton Rouge. Parrish was vastly wealthy and devoutly religious, but possessed a morbid fascination for the occult. He had hired a platoon of ex-soldiers from the recently concluded Civil War, and with them he marched down Bourbon Street and into Marie's store. Despite the protest of her assistants, Marie granted Parrish an audience. He had heard rumors that the great voodoo queen had discovered the secret to eternal life, and demanded that she yield it to him. Never flustered, Marie corrected him. She had indeed discovered a ritual that would grant immortality, but only for a set period of time, 50 years to be exact. Once performed, the subject would rise again after his natural death, having no need for food, air, or water, immune to disease, and utterly impervious to bodily harm. After 50 years had elapsed, however, the subject would die once more, never to rise again. Flustered by this revelation, Parrish nevertheless knew her by her reputation as an honest woman, and would not pass up the opportunity to live beyond his natural lifespan. Marie agreed to conduct the ritual for him, as long as he vowed to leave New Orleans permanently once it had been concluded. Parrish agreed, and the ritual was performed. True to his word, Parrish returned to Baton Rouge later that day, but not before ordering his mercenaries to murder Marie and her assistants and burn her apothecary to the ground. Louisiana folk are renowned for their superstitions, which are many and varied. It was unusual, however, that dozens would later swear that they had seen disembodied shadows making their way en masse to the Parrish manse that night. The following morning, the 15 mercenaries would be found with their necks snapped as though they had been twigs. Parrish himself was discovered in his bed, wide-eyed and apparently terror-stricken. His throat torn out with such ferocity that the state coroner was forced to conclude that a bear had somehow made its way into his locked second-floor bedroom. The hints of black magic were not lost on the locals, however, who promptly buried all 16 bodies in Magnolia Cemetery the following day. Marie Thibodeau was a remarkable woman. She never told a lie, but that's not to say she never withheld the truth. What she had not disclosed was that the resurrection would not take place until 72 hours after death. When Parrish's grave was exhumed for relocation in 1953, puzzled excavators noticed the singularly deep gouge marks found inside the coffin lid.